and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Richard Barbrook. He's about to do some work with the Labour Party on digital democracy. We wanted to talk to him all about digital democracy, about the current state of UK politics, the current state of the Labour Party, and we even got onto a little bit of cultural Marxism and the US political situation. If you enjoy the show, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, you can subscribe to us on YouTube or iTunes, and generally just spread the word about us. So let's get on with the interview. So, Richard, it is lovely to have you on the show. Thank you for appearing on the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me.
No problem. I was intrigued to get to talk to you after I heard John McDonnell mention you in his speech at the Fringe event. That I cannot remember the name of it.
Momentum, the world transformed.
The world transformed.
Yeah, I know. It was. There was a bit of a surprise to me actually, because it was this was the first day of teaching in my university. So actually, I wasn't at Labour Party conference that day. And the next morning, I'm coming down. So it's actually to the world transformed. And suddenly my phone just goes off. Well, all these journalists are trying to get in contact with me. Because it had taken like 12 hours to work out who Richard Barbrook was. And so I talked to a few of them. Actually, the other thing that's happened is I was walking towards the World Transformed to the venue, and this Financial Times journalist suddenly jumps on me and drags me off to a pub to talk to me. So because I'm actually not officially yet working for the Labour Party, but John McDonnell wants me to do various things for the Labour Leadership Office, which I've started doing.
Okay.
And so what he was mentioning is two things. First is setting up a games section for the Labour Party. We did an app game during the election called Corbyn Run that got 2 million impressions and 600,000 downloads or something like that. We were really surprised at how successful it was, and delighted, of course, because it was a sort of, it was a very last minute thing. We just, the snap election, and it took us 10 days to get the team together, another three and a half weeks to make it, and then we had like 2 weeks to promote. So that was good. And also what he was talking particularly at that meeting about was doing wargaming the future, basically. I mean, friends of mine are involved in professional gaming, as it's called, so they do these sort of scenario planning, I guess you'd call it, for things like the military, the civil service, the city. And so what I suggested is getting them in to train initially the Treasury team. We get into power, and it's the time between we win the election and say in the first budget. And to deal with all the things like, maybe we get in when it's a hard Brexit, so the country's in real problems, or there's a run on the pound, or there's capital flight. And what you do is you go through these sorts of scenarios and work out what your responses would be. And of course you can redo them and try different responses. So that's one thing. And then the third thing, which he also talked about, is trying to do some digital democracy experiments. So to get the party membership involved directly in policy making. It'd be really nice if we could crowdsource the next Labour manifesto, or at least some of it, because we've got 550,000 members and they've got lots of ideas and knowledge, and it would be good if they contributed them. So when we say we're for the many, not the few, it also should be by the many, not the few as well.
Well, the manifesto is definitely more democratically put together than the Conservative manifesto.
But it wouldn't be very difficult.
Well, yeah.
Well, it was, but these were, policies passed at conference and in policy forums, which, are democratic, but they're, it's has all the restrictions of representative democracy.
So how much can you talk about what the digital democracy experiments you're
planning? Well, there's two initial things we're looking at. One is to try and get the party membership to decide a policy on universal basic income. So this is an idea that's been floating around obviously for decades, but has come back with a vengeance in the last few years. And interesting, both on the left and the right. So you get, Peter Thiel, who's a Trump supporter, saying we need it. Actually, I think Bill Gates has also come out in favour. We have all this automation, so we give everybody the dole to keep them happy, basically, while we go off and make lots of money. The fact that I also think since they don't want to pay taxes either, I'm not sure who's going to be paying for the basic income.
Yeah.
So there's people on the right, and obviously, and then obviously there are other people on the left. So Paul Mason, who's one of the leading Corbynistas, thinks that the universal basic income is the sort of precursor to communism. So it's had and obviously it also has a lot of critics. I mean, obviously there's people on the right who say, including on the Labour Party, who say basically you're giving people money to just laze around and sit at home smoking weed and watching their telly. Or there's other people who say you're subsidising poverty wages. Anyway, the UBI would be very low. So there's lots of arguments one way or the other, and since there's not an obvious left-right answer, this is one of the reasons why we picked it, actually.
Okay.
I personally, having gone through the benefit system in my 20s, been between being a student and getting proper jobs, I have instinctively, I'm in favour of UBI because it would save you a lot of emotional hassle trying to get benefits out of the system. But on the other hand, I can see the pertinence of the critique. So I'm sort of agnostic on it as well, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in running this particular experiment. There's a great new one come out called Universal Basic Services, where you get food, housing and transport and internet for free, which is an alternative. So there's lots of other things. So this is, as I said, it's not an obvious left-right split, so it's not going to be like Blairites versus Corbynistas. There's arguments on both sides, and so we're going to run it probably around an economics conference. So what you do is you basically announce that we're going to do this beforehand, make a little bit put something on the Labour Party website with lots of information. I've been collecting links to put before and against arguments. Probably do some introductory videos, get somebody to write a little 500 words for each side, and then get the membership to log on. They've got all this information. Have a public event where it's debated as part of probably a conference, probably early next year, I should think now, and then run a software called pol.is, pol.is, and this uses Twitter-like statements where people go yes, no, and it tries to form a consensus out of different opinions. It has to be quite carefully curated to make it work. Audrey Tang, who was the digital minister in Taiwan, used this software to make an Uber law. This is very pertinent, of course, at the moment in London.
Yeah.
So you have these different stakeholders, and they would say, so you have like existing taxi drivers, people who want to be Uber drivers, people who are worried about safety, which is obviously the key issue here, environmentalists, and you try and come to a consensus, which they can all. And they actually did manage to make a law using this software.
What came of the law?
It's in Chinese, so but they got the different groups to come to. So this is a consensus building software. As I said, I've not used it with more than 30 people. So, and the problem there is to try and get something where people actually disagree. If 30 people, especially if they're all of one type of opinion, they all tend to group on one. So we're thinking of trying with this because they're obviously different positions for and against. And just try to see. I said, I don't know, I know it's worked in other circles, but we're going to see by running an experiment how far this software is useful. I know I've also had contacts with people who are involved with the Lula campaign. So Lula wants to stand again for Brazilian president in the next year. Obviously the right are trying to get him banned for alleged corruption. But assuming he runs, he's wants to crowdsource his manifesto using this particular piece of software. So it's quite popular. We're going to try it out. The other piece of software we're interested in is one called Liquid Feedback. This is a Berlin-based software. It was used by the Pirate Party, and now the SPD, the main German opposition party, about to use it for their SPD++ initiative. And this is slightly different. So what it tends to do, it can make a consensus, but what it tends to do is polarise a debate into two opposing positions. It has this very neat way. If you have like 15, in favour of a proposition and with a large majority, and then a minority position, it will polarise into two in the minority position and the majority position. Even if there's lots of it. So the trouble is often you get rankings over, let's take the example of UBI, where there are lots and lots of arguments in favour of UBI, and they will smother the anti-UBI, or vice versa. Okay. And what this does is tend to polarise it into two opposing positions.
Okay.
And then you have a period of what is called consolidation. So you have this debate period where you end up with two alternatives. Sometimes you only end up with one because everyone agrees, but we would hope that to polarise them, to be honest, just to see whether you get. Then you have a period of reflection. Then you have a vote.
Okay.
So that would be the other way of doing it. And so we just want to try that one out. We're discussing with Open Rights Group (ORG) about whether or not we could crowdsource a digital Bill of Rights. So in the Digital Democracy Manifesto, which I coordinated for the second Jeremy for Leadership campaign, there's a promise in there to have a People's Charter of Digital Liberties. And again, so, take things like access or privacy and try and see whether and there's lots of existing bills of digital bills of rights, and see if we can start with their clauses and see whether we can get people to improve them and to try and force the debate. And again, it seems I haven't actually tried this one out, but I'm just interested, having read about it and seen the results of it, whether if we curate it, whether we can actually bring out the debate and see whether we can create two positions and get people to make choices. Mm-hmm. Should privacy be mainly aimed at the state, or should we be more concerned about corporations? That sort of thing. Those are obvious types of things. Or access. What do we mean by access? Mm-hmm. Does everyone have the right to broadband Wi-Fi for free, or not, or something like that? I don't know. Or we could just do another version of the Digital Democracy Manifesto. I don't know. Again, that's something we're going to try that. So the third one is one called pol.is, which is a bit like Reddit actually, which they've been using in, as the name suggests, in Spain, which is based on. It's a bit similar to liquid feedback, but it's based on what's called liquid democracy, where you essentially vote. You lend your vote to people. So you have, it's like a sort of hybrid of representative and direct democracy. It's interesting because the critique I've had from both people who in Barcelona and in Madrid is it creates plebiscitary dictatorship. Because what you have is, so at the base level they have lots of these sort of horizontalist Occupy style meetings of Podemos. But the trouble is the leadership becomes a sort of self-perpetuating dictatorship of stars. So you have, Inglese, who's the leader, and famous academics and journalists, and they essentially, everything they say on this system gets voted to the top. And it excludes those ordinary members, or all their function is to clap the leadership. Mm-hmm. Whereas actually, I think this is exactly what, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, that's actually the very thing they want to avoid, because actually the whole purpose of digital democracy is to actually give a voice to the rank and file members. Mm. So but it works well, I'm told, on a local level where you don't have the stars and so. So what we're thinking of that is to run experiments at a local level. Say get a constituency Labour Party in a marginal, or a sort of Tory seat that Labour ought to win, even though it's got quite a large majority. So a good example. My mother lives in Folkestone, which they had a Labour Party, but it was pretty small, and the local politics is dominated by the Tories and UKIP. But Labour has just won a council seat with a 26% swing, because it's suddenly got a lot of members. So it'd be good to actually try and run an experiment to see, again, that might be not only Labour Party members, but also local supporters, see if you could use it to generate a local manifesto. Friends of mine in Madrid use this software very successfully for planning a city square. So you're thinking of plaza, and you have all these different interest groups, like there's a hotel in the square, there's cafes, there's people who walk their dogs, there's people who live nearby, there's people who have offices, all the different groups, again, stakeholders, to use that awful phrase. And so they use this software to actually make a plan for the square which everyone agreed on. So again, and that was because there was no obvious person that everybody would lend their vote to. No charismatic leaders for that discussion. So that's again what we're thinking of, just trying that out. And I don't think any of these softwares in themselves is perfect or is a magic solution. But they're very interesting, and it's by experimenting we'll find out what the pluses and minuses are.
Mm-hmm.
I should explain that I, being an elder, I think as we're now called, I was involved in pirate and community radio in the 1980s. In fact, that's how first time I ever worked with John McDonnell at the Greater London Council, GLC. Where we were trying to do community radio. So we wanted to make some form of what we used to call the electronic agora, based on the French, the agora électronique. So using analog radio technologies to sort of supplement or deepen representative democracy. And now, of course, we've got digital network technology. But I think one of the things is having this long experience of this is I'm aware that the technology in and of itself is not going to solve the problem. But they are good, but the flip side of it is not to just dismiss the technology or see it as all, a NSA, CIA plot to survey us, or Google and Facebook to control the world. So you can hack the technology.
I think Facebook's inability to deal with the Russian situation right now is proof that they don't have that sort of power.
The imaginary Russians. I got denounced, as an agent of Russia.
Oh, really?
Oh, they produced this list.
Did you appear at some point on Russia Today? Was that where they got you?
Yeah,
just like Boris Johnson's dad.
Afshin, Ratsani's going underground. Actually, to talk about digital liberties, which I think is the funniest thing of all. I don't see any worse appearing on Putin's propaganda channel than Theresa May's propaganda channel, to be honest.
Is that Laura Kunzberg's talk show, is it?
Or Andrew Neil or something. Wow.
Well, Andrew Neil, to be fair, grilled Liz Truss the other day on the Universal Credit helpline. He didn't let her away with it. So.
Okay, he probably knows which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah.
I just thought that was quite funny, really. I would do interviews with people. I do interview with the Financial Times, and I don't see why it's any worse doing it with RT. But it's obviously sort of red baiting, except they're not red anymore, are they?
No. Well, I was listening to a thing the other day that was talking about how Russia Today has such a small reach. Mm. And their most watched or read content has nothing to do with Russian attempts to influence foreign policy or Russia's outlooks on the world. It's often just like interviews you wouldn't get on other sites, and the only people paying close enough attention to it are people
Nick Cohen
who get wound up and aren't going to be influenced by it.
Of course. It's very popular among my students because again, as you said, it puts on people who are on the BBC.
Yeah,
both on the left and the right. So you'll have alternative for the alternative for Germany people there, and the Linke. So the people who the BBC has got such a narrow view of who's allowed on there. That it's not surprising people watch RT, because it's just got a wider range of guests. Given how cheaply they make it, it's incredible actually how much audience it has. But I would encourage people to watch as many different news broadcasts as possible.
Yeah, well, as long as you're aware of where something is coming from, there's never a. As long as you're not watching something and you're thinking, oh, it's on screen, oh, they look professional, they mustn't have an agenda.
The idea that somehow the BBC or the Guardian or the Times or Sky, they don't have agendas. That's the bit I think is really funny. Somehow the West tells the truth and the evil Ruskies tell lies. This is just nonsense. It's funny because that's actually something that has changed my lifetime. So when I was at university as an undergraduate in the late 1970s, that people thought I was a real weirdo for saying the BBC is the British establishment's lie machine. And now it's absolutely mainstream. Most people think that.
Yeah, well, I remember one of the most vivid memories I have of doing history in school. I must have been 13 or 14, and we were talking about sources, and our teacher put on a BBC report about an IRA bombing. And it was at that point that he then started pointing out what was wrong, what they were missing, what they weren't showing. And I was like, oh, the BBC are biased. The BBC have an agenda. And it was like this watershed moment where I was like, trust nobody.
Well, exactly. I mean, I had my parents, particularly my father being right-wing Labour, loved it. Thought the BBC was wonderful. Because it sort of reinforced his sort of left liberal, or whatever you call it, right-wing Labour view of the world. They were sociologically and ideologically close to him, the sort of people around. But again, as you say, it's like growing up realising, why is the lying bastard lying? As only if you went to the 1980s, as I did, on the Labour left. I mean, they were appalling. I mean, the famous example being the Battle of Orgreave, where I knew miners who were there. There's this, they went to protest against this strike breaking going on, and the police attacked them, and then of course, being miners, they fought back, and then the BBC just reversed the footage. That was propaganda. That was fabrication. They deny it, of course, but it was just a mistake. Yeah. So,
you can't see my wry smile here, but
yeah, I know. I mean, as you said, and the war in Ireland that was another place. Well, as I said, you don't have to support the Republican movement to know that they were telling you the facts. They were whipping up one. They were cheerleading for one side against the other, which actually was harmful to the interest of Britain. Actually, I would have said in that particular conflict, because it perpetuated it much longer than it needed to be.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's not to say that outlets like the BBC or any mainstream outlet or any outlet in general is that there's very rarely no good work being done by someone there.
Well, I'm very happy to pay the licence fee to get CBeebies.
But they do.
I have a 4-year-old son.
The BBC do some fantastic
CBeebies
documentaries, Louis Theroux. If I was to pay a licence fee just to get Louis Theroux, I'd be happy. But they do have a lot of really, really excellent documentary programming, and
but the history does tend to be obsessed with kings and queens.
Well, that's true. But it's the same as anything. You've just got to take it with this is the lens they're looking at.
And I used to work in the 1980s with people from Solidarność in Poland, who obviously were well trained at looking at the news and deciphering what they were trying to avoid telling you, or trying to see through the ideological split. But what horrified them about Britain then is the number of people who thought the BBC News was unbiased. I mean, they preferred it, obviously, the Polish Stalinist media, but they just thought this was incredible. And I said, well, that just shows you it's much more effective propaganda, because it's got enough variety in it to make it look like it's neutral, but actually that makes its spin towards the establishment even more effective. And so and you can see that with their horror about Jeremy Corbyn getting elected, and they're re-elected and then doing really well in the election. They still are spluttering about it.
I think the best reaction I have seen was from either the Telegraph or the Daily Mail, and the headline just abandoning all sort of pretense of objectivity. It was like, the momentum is now with Jeremy Corbyn, we have to stop him, as the front page, and I was like, look, come on, try a little bit harder to pretend you're not.
Well, they are, but it's the Tory graph, so you'd expect it as a part, you wouldn't expect socialist worker to be very one-sided. So but the BBC, claims to be balanced and impartial and neutral, and that I just think is laughable. And as I said, the thing about the whole RT thing, which actually I have a yellow line through it, because I'm supposedly an agent. I'm somehow important to some sense, and I don't know why, given this humble room. But anyway, so the idea that I sort of caught an hour interview with with the Russian international channel is somehow going to change people's minds. It's just laughable.
Yeah.
I mean, the sustained propaganda from the BBC has been over the years. I mean, but what's interesting, I think, now is the plethora of alternative sources of information. Squawk Box, Canary, Evolve Politics, Vox Politica, Another Angry Voice, Tom Pride. I mean, there were all these little websites. Some of them are just basically like webzines, blogs. Actually,
And most of them only popped up in the last 24 months.
Well, the reason they popped up is because the mainstream media wasn't reflecting what large numbers of people thought. I mean, Another Angry Voice had the top 2 most shared articles in the election, beating, all these mainstream media.
Yeah.
I mean, by a lot as well. He had, as this is like one guy in Yorkshire, making nice little visuals, which you, when you share it on Facebook, it comes up with a nice little visual, and then his either analysis or even better rant against the Tories, Brexit, or wherever else he does. I was told, I don't know him, but I was told by somebody who does that during the election people were going around and cooking him dinner to keep him on his computer. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I assume there must be people feeding him and keep paying the rent. But I mean, fair dues to the guy. Of course, now he's being denounced as fake news. Nick Robinson was speaking at my university, Westminster, recently, where he claimed all the
Mr. Impartial.
Oh yes, the member of wasn't he this Oxford Cambridge Students' Union or something?
Yeah, he founded the Conservative Youth Group. I think it was Macclesfield or not.
No, I thought it was Oxford, wasn't he?
As well, there's a couple of different Tory groups.
He's a multiple offender.
Yeah.
But and he was blaming, I don't know, the Canary for the murder of Joe Cox.
Oh, I saw that. That was pathetic.
And then you got the same Jonathan Friedland, this poor woman who got blown up in Malta, doing the same thing. So you can see they're really, really scared because they live. As they say, they go on about filter bubbles, but they're the biggest filter bubble of them all. They're all. It's not just that they all went to posh schools and posh universities and all. They'll all know each other and go to dinner parties and go drinking with each other and probably sleep with each other as well. But you can. When we launched the Digital Democracy Manifesto 2 years ago. It was really, it's actually a year ago actually, not 2 years, a year ago. It was really interesting because so Jeremy and I and Ava Pascoe was speaking. We're in this little venue and they were all in the front and it was like a pack. They were all little pack. And it didn't matter whether they were the BBC or the Sun. They were all the same and they all knew each other and they all basically took the same line to mock Jeremy. I mean, we were pleased because we got through to our intended audience of techies, but you could see that they have much more in common than they do with a lot of the population, and that's their problem. And what horrifies them is when suddenly they realise, as Guy Debord would say, they're just a univocal monologue about themselves.
Yeah, it's one thing I do always like to say about sort of that sort of journalistic establishment is that no one is ever the villain of their own story, and they truly, I think, believe what they're putting out there.
Best propaganda.
Like because I think a lot of people have this like image built up in their head of like the people sat around the table being like, right, how can we make the poor miserable and it's I feel like it's more a self-perpetuating thing where they've grown up where neoliberalism, if you want to put it like that, is the ideology. This is the ground, this is the fertile ground, this is how the economy is supposed to work, this is how politics is supposed to work, this is how society is supposed to work, and that's just their
But it's not an ideology.
construct.
It's not an ideology for them. It's the only way of thinking. It's a common sense.
Yeah.
And then when people come along and point out that it doesn't work,
They do think it's ludicrous.
Yeah, it's ludicrous. It's intellectually vapid. They get really threatened because they suddenly realise that everything that they think is important isn't. And the fact that large numbers of people, millions as it proved, agree with this proposition is for them very worrying. And of course then they have to blame the Russians or the Canary or Swarp. I mean, they've got to blame someone else other than the fact that most people, through their life experience, knows that neoliberalism has reached its limits, not just economically, but socially, politically, environmentally. And we need some radical change, otherwise things really are going to get bad.
Yeah, that's the sort of level of wealth inequality is just scary when you look at the...
And then there's people sleeping on the streets in one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, it's not as bad as America. I mean,
I do.
But they're getting it. They're trying to work up to that level. And it's the punishing the poor deliberately, but they think they're doing them good, by punishing them, getting them into jobs.
It's incentivising people.
Incentivising. Well, they're going to get now. They're not going to get any foreign labour from Latvia and Poland and Romania and Bulgaria. They're going to have to mobilise, conscript them into picking fruit or something. I know it's interesting that about the way that as you say, it's a class bubble. They don't know anybody outside their own group. So, something, when the fact that large numbers of people in the country think differently from them, they find a bit of a shock. I mean, it's interesting that they find it easier that people to be on to the right of them than to the left of them. So they find fascists or UKIPers or mad Brexiters. They can sort of understand that. That's like their crazy uncle or aunt, because they're nice. Basically, they're nice Tory. They're nice Tories, and then there's a more drunken uncle Tory. Yeah, but what they found really difficult is lefties, because lefties are somehow, we might have gone through it for a month at university, but then we grew up, and then suddenly they think, oh shit, they're going to come to power.
Yeah. Well, what was it Corbyn got? The second highest vote total since the Second World War for a Labour Prime Minister? In terms of sheer number of votes.
Yeah. Well, it's all a bit difficult because the electorate changes.
Well, and the population grows.
But it's basically it's one of the best results since basically it's the 1997 election and the 1945 election. I mean, the thing is, of course, the UKIP vote collapsed into the Tory vote, so they also did pretty well, given there'd been 7 years of austerity. Yeah. But the fact that we managed to deprive them of their majority was a real achievement. Especially, as he said, we were fighting not just the Tories, but shall we say, a large group inside our own party.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, it really gives me a little bit of hope to see. When I was in Canada on election night, and I was able to stay up and watch the results all night essentially, because I was 5 hours ahead.
Yeah.
5 hours behind, and having watched Bernie Sanders' campaign in America gain so much momentum and get so close and then just fall short and kind of not dissipate, because he's really kept up his momentum in a way that I didn't even honestly believe was quite possible at the time, but it was really he didn't quite get there. You felt like hope was kind of gone, and it's nice to see.
Well, because the Democratic Party preferred to lose to Trump than win Bernie.
Yeah.
I was told by this guy Josh in 2015, November 2015. He said it was either Trump or Bernie. He comes. This guy came from Kansas. He lived in a trailer park when he was a teenager. I think he was an academic when I was a student. And he just said, "There's no way the white working class where he lived was going to vote for the Clintons after what they'd done to them." Yeah. And all this. Okay, there's a big white racist vote, but a lot of it was just a protest vote against NAFTA and being shafted by it, and also the fact that Obama didn't deliver. People forget that. He came.
Well, he struggled because of the Republican Congress.
He didn't try.
Well, I would dispute that in that there was, I agree there are things he didn't try on, but there's a lot of legislation that went to Congress and got stonewalled by the Republicans. There was the DREAM Act, there was more infrastructure bills, there was improvements on Obamacare.
He had 2 years where he controlled Congress.
And he didn't waste it all.
No, he didn't want to. But he didn't want to. He didn't want to change things. He got Larry Summers to point his, look at the people he had. Bob Rubin. It was, a lot of it. City Corps appointed his first cabinet, so he was just a Wall Street puppet.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you there. There was a lot of establishment Republicans and Democrats in that cabinet in a way that there probably shouldn't have been, given the type of rhetoric that he was using on the campaign trail. But I still think overall he was a pretty decent president, in my mind anyway, given what he had to deal with. But
African Americans ended up, after 8 years of the first black president, worse off than they started.
Yeah, there was something I was listening to the other day talking about how because of who he was, it meant he could be much more conservative on social issues than he maybe would than a white person might have got away with. Yeah. But anyway, to come back to Britain.
Well, that's what we got to learn from. It's not just. It's not just getting elected, but it's once you're in power, how do you ensure the people, that you work not just on behalf of the people, but the people can actually participate in power. Because there's a great book called The New Machiavelli by Jonathan Powell, who was Blair's chief of staff, and it's there's funny things like he doesn't realise that Prince is a satire. He thinks it's a serious book in that way. But you see that there's this small group of people, some of whom are pretty talented, some of whom are pretty naive in my view, and all they think they can wheeler dealer them their way through power, but they end up being absorbed by the establishment. Partly because they didn't want to change anything, but it's also that. If it's just replacing one small group with another small group, even if they've got better policies in certain areas, isn't really a solution to what's the crisis we're facing. There's what John McDonnell said. There's no way a few hundred Labour MPs or even tens of thousands of activists can make a decision. What you need to have is millions of people wanting to change things, and then they're irresistible. And then apartheid collapsed, or the end of Stalinism in Eastern Europe. So if there are lots of people that determine that things will get better, really, rather than just rhetorically, that they want change, proper change, they've got to be involved in the process. And, so Jeremy and John, they come out of this experience of the GLC, the Greater London Council, where we got elected in 1981 on a left-wing platform and just kept moving leftwards until Thatcher abolished the council because she couldn't win the next election for it. And one of the reasons why it was so popular is because it included people in the policy-making process. So John McDonnell's always a great example of this, is there wasn't a lesbian and gay councillor in the group. But they knew that homophobia was wrong because it was dividing the working class. So they rang up Gay Switchboard and said, what should we do? What policies should we adopt? And obviously then they had meetings, they got people in, and they got, set up consultation and started doing these policies, which were incredibly innovative. And we got absolutely monstered by the Tory media. We were buggers and paedophiles and all the usual.
That's ironic.
Yeah, and then 30 years later the Tory party passed a Gay Marriage Act. Yeah, this is ironic because obviously leading members of Thatcher's government were incredibly gay.
Well, Ted Heath, I was thinking.
Well, that's true. I was also thinking Norman St John Stevens, for instance.
Thatcher's friendship with Nicholas Savile
and Nicholas Fairbairn, and all these other people who have various allegations against them. Yeah, but that doesn't matter. It's propaganda, in a way, because they're hypocrites. But the key thing is that in this story, not that they smeared us and were hypocritical. That's not really the important one. The important story is how do we counter that? Was by mobilising people behind the agenda. And obviously, again, it's interesting with something like homophobia. Lots of people in the 80s, not so much now, obviously, were, by their default setting would be homophobia until you said to them, well, but your cousin is gay. Your aunt is a lesbian. And if you actually brought it out, it's like why, gay people used to go on about coming out, because everybody came out, they would suddenly realise how bloody ludicrous homophobia was, because everybody had some gay relative somewhere, lesbian relative, or friends or something. And there's one thing sort of having, having homophobia against some abstract people you don't, but if they're your relatives, or your friends, suddenly
the person you see in the corner of the street every day.
Yeah, exactly. Then it just drops. It's like with immigrants, isn't it? Like the most racist parts of Britain, the ones we have the least immigrants.
That does make me laugh a lot.
Yeah, because they don't know anybody. Whereas going to London and it's like this because it's a very and has been for centuries a multicultural, multilingual city. Obviously, there is racism in London. You come across it all the time. Especially when we were canvassing, it was interesting. But often it's racism between different immigrant groups. All these bloody foreigners are coming over here who can't speak English, says somebody who's obviously from the Caribbean. So there's that sort of. It's that sort of thing that is actually to make people understand that the prejudices, often which they're picking up from the mainstream media, are actually ludicrous. But you have to actually do something about it. And I think it's a more general thing. I'll just quote John McDonnell where he says, he said, if you want to work out how the best way to run the railways, you don't get many management consultants. You ask the people who drive the trains and lay the track and clean the carriages and sell the tickets and so on. They're the people who know how to run a railway because they're running the bloody railway at the moment.
Yeah, and they're not taking a 10% cut of all the cuts they make either.
No, and also again, people forget that that this isn't they're not some uneducated peasants. These people, they're often very. They've all been to school. Some of them have been to universities. They've read lots of books.
Yeah, but they're working on it every day.
Exactly. And so they even have. I'm just saying they have the abstract knowledge as well as the practical knowledge.
Yeah.
And the thing is to mobilise that talent and creativity in a way, because neoliberalism, what neoliberalism has done is, though it goes on about individual freedom and choice, actually what it does is atomise people and make them feel powerless. And so, in one of the ways, it seems to me, you've got to change society so people feel like they can contribute. Because, in a way, there's a lot of wastage in this society because people are not allowed to participate and add their ideas and suggest better ways of doing things. So stupid things are done, because the knowledge base. Again, it comes back to this idea: if it's a small group, replacing one clique with another clique. It doesn't work like that, because even if they were even if the next Labour government was controlled, was run by the most brilliant minds in the country, it can't be as clever as the large part of the population. So it's not just, it's just not for the many, but it's got to be by the many, of the many. Actually, sound like Abraham Lincoln, don't I? But that's a very, the government of the people, for the people, by the people.
Yeah,
and I think this, this is, he's celebrating the great victory of the Union Army over the slave owners, and that was the citizen army, and they the citizens actually went out there on the battlefield, took on the slave owners, and whipped their asses. And that's how we've got, okay, we're not going to have, what we need to do is just get people involved directly in running the things which they're involved in their lives, and I can't see how it could be managed worse than the existing institutions.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. My mum's a nurse, so I get to hear endlessly about the state of the NHS.
And it's managers. If you got rid of most of the managers, the place would run 10 times.
The matrons on each ward used to run each ward almost individually.
And they knew how the ward would run, and they could, and between them they informally did lots of things, which now have been put onto a computer system and a spreadsheet. So they then waste a huge amount of time filling out forms instead of actually looking after patients. But it's everywhere. I mean, university, the police. You talk to police. I mean, I had a student last year who was a policeman. And he said that they were actually trying to avoid arresting people for some crimes because the paperwork for minor offences.
Durham, they stopped prosecuting marijuana offences, and there's a couple of other things, but that was more on the principle of being ridiculous. But
this guy said that he said to me when Jeremy got elected, and he did say the one thing you could do to make police happy is legalise marijuana, not because they want to smoke dope themselves, though I assume some of them do, but they just think it's a complete waste of time where they arrest some guy fine them, and then they have to go back out on the street and deal even more weed to pay the fine. It's a bit like with the laws against prostitution. So whatever you think about prostitution, criminalising the prostitutes is not the solution.
No.
And the same thing, you might... Well, anyway,
the Green Party got a lot of flack for suggesting that it should be decriminalised.
Yeah.
What an outrageous suggestion. Don't prosecute people for doing things that they want to do.
Well, it's also
forced into doing.
It's also interesting, the way it's changed as soon as the Americans started legalising weed. And again, it shows that complete subservience. I mean, marijuana wasn't illegal in this country until the Americans made it illegal, and we copied them in the 1920s. And now the Americans are legalising marijuana. Suddenly, surprise, surprise, large numbers of British politicians think it's a good idea. So this is
none of the current government, unfortunately.
Not yet, but they're desperate for the youth vote, so it's exactly the sort of thing I think they would do, and it's cheap. You can save money, actually. There's a good...
The Adam Smith Institute proposed a millennial manifesto. I don't know if you saw it, but it involved legalising weed, ecstasy, cocaine, and lowering flight duties for under 30 so they could go to Ibiza cheaper.
All right.
This was like their proposal for what the Conservative Party should do.
But they've always been a bit idiosyncratic. They're so-called libertarians.
Yeah.
When I was teaching doing my doctorate in Kent University in the mid-1980s, there was this guy called Mark Henry Glendenning, who was the Libertarian Alliance. So he came down to speak. And so I had all these students who were like lefties, some of them in the SWV, and they all turned up to heckle him, and all these rugby club owners, basically the Conservatives at Kent University, turned up to cheer him. And so he was, terrible on the NHS and trade unions, but he was like pro-gay, pro-drugs, pro-feminism. I mean, all these, and they ended up with my lefty students having to protect him from the rugby club who wanted to beat him up. And then they personally took him out for a drink, and then took him down to the railway train and made sure he got safely back to London. And I thought that was really interesting because socially, culturally, they were completely the same. It was just on the economy. That strange thing about it's more obvious now about neoliberalism, where you can be have a sex change and still be a Republican like that. Was it the Kardashian?
Caitlyn Jenner.
Yeah, it's Caitlyn Jenner. So that's a really classic example of it. It's an individual.
She's not pro-gay marriage either, which I find funny, but it also highlights the kind of not ludicrous nature of, but having the LGBT vote as one vote in people's mind, I always think is crazy, because
there's a lot of very good critiques coming out now of identity politics in America from the left.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read Viewpoint magazine or Jacobin or Chapo Trap House, or the dirtbag left, as I love to call themselves.
Yeah, well, we had.
I mean, I'm not surprised because it's very liberal, isn't it? It's all like.
It's not. That's a lot of people's problems with it. Is that they see it as neo-Marxism in that they're the
cultural Marxism.
Yeah, cultural Marxism in that we had our most listened to episode was with a professor from Evergreen University.
It's a great name. Where's that?
Nevada.
Somewhere in the middle of the map.
Maybe it's not Nevada. I should know this. We interviewed him.
somewhere in the Midwest.
Yeah, but anyway,
the heartland.
But his this guy Brett Weinstein, anyway, he's a fantastic, brilliant guy. Really.
And he said
really
he made a joke in class.
No, it wasn't even that. So they had a day of absence where, for years, based on this book, where black people didn't come into work for a day. It was like set in the 40s or whatever. It was to highlight
what you mean, like the cleaners?
Kind of, yeah. So all the black people didn't arrive in this town in the morning, and all the white people had no idea what to do because it was all the lower class jobs because it was in the 40s.
Yeah. I remember my father had spent a summer in Princeton on doing some academic thing there, and in the morning, this is Princeton University being one of these Ivy League places, and then in the morning seeing the buses coming in bringing all the black workers, basically black and Latino workers from a nearby town, You know, and so the faculty and the students are overwhelmingly white. I assume they still are. And the people who do all the menial jobs are, surprise, of a different colour. But I think, you know, what's interesting about it, the critique is saying, well, it's about, you know, what they're doing is hiding class politics. And obviously, the working class in America particularly is divided by race. And it has been for centuries. But
the Trump supporters and the Bernie supporters had realised that they were so close to wanting the same thing. Like when I read Bernie's book, I was just...
Well, that's what this guy Joss said, you know. He said it was Bernie or Trump, you know. And it's something you had to... I mean, you know, in a sense it was a false result. But, you know, the idea, you know, there's this sort of idea of white privilege. I mean, that's interesting. You know, there's some poor whites in America are, you know, dying of opioids. And but I mean, what privilege do they have? I mean, you know, there's large parts of America where white people are in a really, really bad condition.
Well, I guess a lot of the argument is kind of that almost To Kill a Mockingbird-esque one. You see, you know, you scrub hard enough, you get down to...
Everyone's black. Well, especially in the South, isn't it? I mean, everyone, they'd all be, you know, how the idea that anyone is pure white or pure black is a bit of a joke, really, given the history of the area. But what I think is interesting about that is, you know, the original critique of someone like W.E.B. Du Bois and people who put this forward was actually that white privilege doesn't just harm people of colour, it harms white people. That's the point he's making in Black Reconstruction, that there was this moment after the American Civil War where, you know, poor whites and poor blacks had a common interest against the old ruling elite, the plantocracy in the South, and racism was used to divide and rule them, and they both lost out to it. Okay, maybe, you know, you come from Northern Ireland, hey, you know all about this, you know, you divide and rule. Yeah. You know, if you go to West, you know, I went to West Belfast many years ago, and you couldn't really tell any difference between the nationalist ghettos and the unionist ghettos.
No, there is. They're like the only difference is the flag flying outside their house.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're... and okay, yes, if you were a unionist, maybe you got a slightly better job and you had more chance of having, and they had certain...
Yeah, well, there were certain companies wouldn't hire Catholics, and there was like certain housing benefits not being afforded to them.
Exactly. So there was some... You could see there were some unionist privilege, but actually overall it meant that both communities suffered, because if they united against the ascendancy in the north, they would be in a much better condition, all of them, you know, and right up to now actually you can see there's a problem. You know, as long as there's large walls between them, they're not going to unite against the people above them. And so I think it's interesting the way that something like white privilege is actually, it has 100% different meaning for what it originally was thought of by people who originally put this forward. But that's because they were Marxists, and lots of these identity politics people, though they might claim, you know, or they claim to be cultural Marxists, as far as I can see, they've never read a word of Marx in their entire life. Or if they have, they've read it through the filter of cultural studies, Stuart Hall or Adorno, who aren't Marxists in my view, to be honest. We used to say in the 1980s, the Labour left, one of the Labour left slogans was "Cultural studies, it is the class enemy," because they were, because, you know, so the GLC was very strong on fighting racism, sexism, heterosexualism, disableism, because we wanted to unite the working class around a common project. And it's interesting, when we did surveys of people in London, you know, gay people were really grateful that we'd stood up and said respect our gay brothers and lesbian sisters. But what their major concern was like everyone else. It was housing, you know, employment, transport, healthcare. And so it wasn't like a substitute for class issues. It was something that had to be combined with it. And you can see, you know, if you want to change America, obviously you have to fight racism. I mean, you know, you're a young black male, you're going to get gunned down on the streets by police or gangsters. There's a very good chance of this. So there isn't. Black lives do matter, and it's important. But, you know, the way you solve the underlying problems of America is actually to deal with the rather vicious form of capitalism that's there, as Bernie points out.
Yeah, well, but this is the issue that never got mentioned in the debates. Like Trump had his economic message, and that was front and centre. But Clinton, the identity politics was
a substitute for economics.
Yeah, it was. It's almost like a distraction. But the thing with
it is a distraction. No, I think it's exactly what it is. Yeah. It's, you know, they're liberals. You know, liberals don't want class politics. we're all beyond that. That's all the past. It's Fordism. It's we're now at the end of history. Ideology doesn't matter. It's just competing interest groups. And you just form a coalition. I mean, Blair was the same. I mean, it's not an accident that people like Stuart Hall were the theorists of Blair. It's interesting now. His sort of academic admirers just airbrushed this out of the story. He was involved in this group called Marxism Today, a laughable title, and they attacked the Labour left. They said, you support the miners and you support trade unionists, and they're all horrible stinky males and sexist and heterosexist, but we're going to have all these little community, and it's very much the professional middle class basically. And let's dump the mass of the working class. And it's that little class fraction they build. And it's not surprising the Blairites took it over. And that's what you do. We're going to have Blair, lots more women, and we're going to be nice to gays, but actually remove the class politics which has to be associated with it.
Yeah. Well, to go back to that
end of rant.
Yeah, to go back to that level where we started there. The thing with Brett Weinstein happened was the day of absence, and then they suggested that it was either last year or this year that they weren't going to have a day of absence, that all white students and faculty weren't going to be allowed to come to the class.
Going to be allowed.
And he went, hang on, that's different. That's very different. And then just got threatened. There was protests. He was like, forced.
But isn't it? Isn't that the wrong way round anyway?
Yeah, no, 100%.
It's denying the whole point of the protest.
Yeah, this was the scary part for me, because I heard people talking about the problems with like social justice warriors, and I'd heard Jordan Peterson sort of talk briefly about the dangers of postmodernists and cultural Marxists.
Cultural studies, it is the class enemy.
Yeah,
I think we should. I'm going to get a T-shirt.
Get a T-shirt with that.
Well, yeah. I'm get them just paint.
I'd be cool with that. I'd wear it.
It's interesting because I know Angela Nagel, who wrote this brilliant book called "Kill All Normies" about the alt-right and and the internet. Basically.
The Kekistanis.
Yeah, Kekistan. I mean, it's really, really good. So most of it's about that, and she has one chapter in it where she pointed out that this sort of social justice warrior, political correctness was actually encouraging these people. These people were using this, and actually they're a form of identity politics.
Oh yeah, it's 100% a reaction to it.
And also that if you go around having identity politics, it allows Nazis to say, well, we've got identity politics as well. And she got absolutely monstered for something which actually I don't think that she thought was very controversial. And certainly when I read the book, I just thought, well, I quite enjoyed it because she was taking the pee out of people I don't particularly like. But I didn't think that it was particularly controversial. But it obviously hit a raw nerve on large parts of especially American left.
Yeah.
And she was a bit stunned by it, actually. I think, I noticed that she adopted the Irish spelling of her name onto Facebook, so she wasn't as easy to find. But I think what it was also, because a lot of people, it's, to use Pierre Bourdieu's phrase, it's their cultural capital. You can, you become a sort of self-appointed spokesperson for some micro community. Because again, it's interesting. Then this sort of politics doesn't have like the Labour Party, where you have formal structures. It's all what Joe Flynn called tyranny of structurelessness. So you end up with this star system. So people who get access to the media, get funding from foundations, get academic jobs, or just can shout the loudest, they become the self-appointed leaders of the movement, and therefore they have what they have a vital interest in being a big fish in a small pond, and obviously monstering anybody who's a threat to them. And you see this actually. It's interesting. Again, it seems to be much worse in America than here. And I think the good thing about the whole revival of Labour left, is that everybody has to sort of get together in one project, and it becomes more difficult to do. But we've seen this with poor old Clive Lewis just making a rather funny remark, being twisted around as if he's some wild misogynist, especially as he said it to a man. I thought that was the funniest thing of all. So that whole movement again, it's interesting because it does. You're right that it does have a theoretical basis, because obviously one of the things that this cultural Marxism, Marxists who never read Marx, is that they think that words create reality. So it comes from Lenin and Trotsky and Mao and Gramsci, and then all these people who popularised them in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, the Stuart Halls, but also, you said, the postmodernists, Derrida and Foucault and Deleuze, Guattari. So it's all about, if you change the ideology, you change the world. And so what words become incredibly important.
But then that's where they're kind of,
so material
use these words that we're going to give to you.
Yeah, and impose them on you.
Yeah.
But it's a way of, so Marx and Engels wrote this very great polemic in the 1840s against people who thought that at the time. That were called,
what was it called?
It's called the German ideology.
Okay.
And if you read Stuart Hall, he only reads the edited version. Yeah, where they take out all the bits where they mock people who take this position. They call them the Dalai Lamas. This is not actually a compliment in their view, and they actually call this belief that they have this wonderful phrase that they say these are the people who think that you drown because of the idea of gravity, not because water is wet. And so they live in a world of phantoms basically. Yeah, and so not surprising if you go bow to their ghosts, they get really scared, because actually they, again, you can see this. They're intellectuals, they're artists. That's what they do for a living: is produce words, produce images, produce symbols. So it's not surprising they think their own labour process is the most important one. So it's a sort of narcissism.
Yeah, well, it's a self-confirming ideology.
Yeah, and obviously it's a lot to do, which is the liberalism. It's all about my own identity. My me. I. It's all about realising myself. Yeah, and that's the problem, because actually, of course, we can't. And that's what neoliberalism wants to make it. It's all about the individual competing with every other individual. Yeah, and so you either compete for money or virtue or whatever. Whereas actually, of course, the only way you can change society is to operate collectively. Because actually capitalism, though it all looks like it's individual, is the most collective system ever invented. Because that's what money does. It connects millions and millions, billions of people all together. Look at the world market. That's probably the most, it's a homogenising, collectivising system ever made. But it just it appears as the individual making choices. I choose to have this job. I choose to buy this product. I choose to have this identity or affirm or whatever. And so that's, I think, is really interesting. This is why, as I said, I don't think these so-called cultural Marxists have read any Marx. It's interesting, as I said, I know I keep hitting Stuart Hall because he seems to have had a recent revival. But if you read his books, it's interesting. He's obviously read less Marx than some undergraduates I taught. It's just the basic short text, but he never studied Capital, which is, because how anyone can claim to have any knowledge of his writings without actually studying the critique of political economy, which he spent most of his life working on, because he thought, well, that's actually how capitalist society operates, is not through ideology, actually, it's through the operations of money. And that's really important. It's a very big shift in how we change the way. So, if we're going to change capitalism and evolve beyond it, we have to actually think about how the system really works and not be trapped within its superficial surface appearance, which is essentially what they are. It's interesting because they're very uncritical of the very thing they claim to be critical of, which is culture, actually. But that's another story.
Well,
as an old punk, I will make this assertion. The funny thing is that I missed all this in Momentum. They actually had a Stuart Hall reading group, but it was at 9:30 in the morning. Otherwise, they would have gone on to heckle. And they also had this session called Acid Corbynism. And there's this friend of mine pointed out the one thing that was definitely true is none of them had taken any acid. Which I thought said it all, really, that it was just a phrase, it's just a word.
Yeah. But to
and then they can have a little bit of psychedelic design, a bit like Wired magazine. Hey, though there again, actually, though, to be fair to Wired, I assume as old hippies, they had taken some acid. Oh.
Well, I can imagine that would be a much more entertaining conference.
Well, it wouldn't be as productive.
Well,
I think the importance of let's be serious about Labour Party Conference. It was an amazing achievement.
It really was. It was genuinely exciting to watch.
Think of the Labour Conference like a few years ago, where sort of corporate promotion exercises, away days, corporate away training days, that sort of thing. And to see it now, the World Transform was really impressive, actually. Despite having Stuart Hall reading groups, to see that, and in a way, it's good that you have this diversity. You have people from the right over to the people on the left, and you have all that diversity of opinion. And there isn't a party line, so it's not like going to say the SWP's so-called Marxism conference, where basically they all spout the party line. There isn't a party line, the party line is argument and debate, and we're all pro the whatever the Labour left means, but actually it's a very diverse and heterogeneous group of people, including some people who I actually would say are on the right.
Well, I think the manifesto is other proof of that, because it's really not that extreme a manifesto. Like there are, like, don't get me wrong, there are like fairly left wing policies in it, but
we got broadband for all, didn't it?
Yeah. But
since then, Jeremy has promoted platform cooperative. So we now got two clauses of the Digital Democracy Manifesto in Labour policy.
Well, I remember he got slaughtered a few years ago by the press, unsurprisingly, for talking about Internet of Things technology and how he wanted Britain to be really prolific.
The fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, and he was talking all about that, and it was like someone was being like, great way to win over the working class there, Jeremy. And I was like, this is what we need. This is smart.
Well, obviously, people like John McDonnell, he's read Marx's Capital. He doesn't know he doesn't understand the critique. Yeah, and obviously, what's happening is yet another, recomposition of the working class, another change in the way capitalism operates. And so, on the one hand, you want to go beyond capitalism, setting up cooperatives, maybe doing a basic income or universal basic services, revitalising the NHS in a more democratic way, and these sort of things. But also, in a way, you also need to sort of control the monster. Because people, because initially you always you have to have a period of transition of some kind, and it's also, the interesting thing is now we have a Conservative Party, the managing committee of the bourgeoisie, that seems to be it's operating against the interest of large sections of the bourgeoisie by heading straight off the Brexit cliff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know how anti the establishment that really is, because...
Well, there's differences within the establishment.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, but I feel a big part of what drove the Conservative Party and UKIP to want out of Europe was tax evasion regulation.
Yeah, I'm sure this is true. A lot of people would say this. I reposted it on Facebook yesterday.
We'll have a shameless plug for our article about it.
Good, you're right. You have an article about it.
We'll put it in the
I think it's interesting because I said my mother is in her early 80s, so she remembers the Second World War and is therefore very, very definitely a Remainer. But she blames the people slightly younger than herself who grew up on all those heroic war movies of Britain standing alone, the Dam Busters, Battle of Britain, The Longest Day type things, and the alliance with America, actually.
Wow.
I don't know, and I think that's an interesting way of thinking, that they grew up in that period where Britain still had an empire, it was just losing an empire, and it's a sort of nostalgia for a sort of imaginary 1950s. And I can see that from, it's interesting how
I don't know if that accounts for 17 million, though.
No, it doesn't account for, but she's talking about a certain group of people who she's familiar with.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how the age split in the vote is really interesting. It's it was 2/3 of Tory voters voted for what is a very radical change in the country's position. I mean, I don't think they were aware of quite how radical the change was that they were voting for. But that's why I find quite interesting, though, whether you could have such a radical change when your foot soldiers are in their 70s and 80s is another thing. You know, normally you need to have lots of young, fit males to do that sort of radical change. But
I guess it was a vote for what I like to call Schrodinger's Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, there was... well, it's interesting. Yeah, there's, as I said, there's obviously different types of visions. I mean, there's still this sort of hangover of the Tony Benn anti-common market view that, you know, we should become Cuba with worse weather. You know, the EU is a symbol of, you know, neoliberal globalisation. It's interesting because
the EU is not perfect.
No way. It's interesting. I went canvassing for Another Europe is Possible, which is basically was the official Labour policy. Not that we got much traction in the mainstream media. And I remember this guy saying to me on the doorstep, he's saying, basically, the EU is shit, but Brexit is much worse. I'll never vote for Leave because it's supported by Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And I mean, most of the people I was handing these leaflets out in my estate, I didn't like the EU very much, but they just thought the alternative was much worse. And I think that, you know, that's the problem. Is the real criticisms of the EU have been lost in this. You have to take a for or against position. When again, this is interesting if you think about referendums, about the polarisation into two choices. It excluded the other choice, which is let's try and make another Europe, basically.
Yeah. And to be fair to David Cameron, I'm not normally a huge fan.
The pig fans.
But he did get some reasonable concessions out of Europe.
What were they?
You know, there was a little bit more sort of flexibility on future treaties. But he's usually opted out of things which are helping the environment and workers. Yeah. They want to opt out, or tax evasion. Well, not enforced marketisation or privatisation. It's interesting what they wanted to change. So I think you know, but the difficulty is, and I think this comes back to the digital democracy debate, is if you want to have mass participation in politics, you know, having a yes/no referendum is a very difficult way to do it, unless you have repeated referendum. I mean, you know, it's interesting. I've taught over the years many times, and I've known Swiss people, and they have repeated referendums all the time.
Yeah, and so that seems to work because, yes, you're consulting the people, but not just on one-offs. You know, you consult them and you consult them and you consult them and you consult them.
Yeah, it's not like when you got that Brexit vote, like, this is our one chance.
Yeah. So really, there ought to be an annual Brexit vote. So that should be on there. Well, you know, but that's essentially what we're ending up with annual election. The levellers in 1647 demanded annual election, and we've almost got that. They demanded universal male suffrage, which took from 1918, from 1647 to 1918 division. We still haven't got annual elections, but we seem to be getting closer. We've had a general election, a referendum, now a general election.
If you're from Northern Ireland, we pretty much do have annual elections.
But you never have a government.
Well, no, that is true. So it doesn't always work.
It doesn't always work. But it's interesting about that, about whether, if you're going to have some more participatory democracy, where, you know, that just having one-offs doesn't really work. It should be not just an event. It should be a process where people are being educated, going through the argument, and then it would allow a wider group of possibilities. Because as I said, that was my biggest complaint about the referendum, is that it excluded other solutions. It was either you have to think the EU was wonderful, basically, or it was, you know, let's get out. And to me, I don't agree with either of those positions.
No. I personally, I voted Remain. I was like the perfect, so if you had like a breakdown from the UK of the most likely demographic to vote Remain, it was someone from Northern Ireland who was university educated and was a Green Party voter. And that's or
a Sinn Féin voter. That's great. The Shinners, who absolutely were historically always against the EU, have now become the most pro-EU party in Ireland, which for very good reasons. You know, I think their core constituency definitely. Though I was told by a friend of mine from Northern Ireland that the boys are all rubbing their hands and they thought that smuggling might come back. They don't really want to go back to the armed struggle, but smuggling definitely would be a good idea. So I don't know. I think that's really. I think it's really interesting though, if you think about the way the debate has been framed. It's in a way saved the EU from the criticism it should have, because the alternative is so much worse. And at the Labour Party conference, apart from the obvious red flag, there were two flags really obviously being bandied up, flown and waved, which is one, the Palestinian flag. Obviously, I mean, after the Israeli embassy, weaponised this whole anti-Semitism smear, it's not surprising people will suddenly convince people that they should become as pro-Palestinian as possible. And the second was the EU flag, and it wasn't just right-wing, the sort of Blairite romp, but there was a demo actually, pro-EU demo when I was there. But it was interesting, the Momentum events, there were lots of little, people wearing EU badges. And so they've actually, the greatest achievement of the Brexiteers is to make the EU popular in England, which is an amazing achievement. In Ireland, you can tell why people are in favour of the EU, because it gave money, yes, money, obviously, but also it's a way of asserting their autonomy from the old colonial master. It gives them they're not totally, they've got political independence, but not an economic independence. Mm. So, and those subsidies do help with that. But it's amazing.
Every time a bus pulls up in Belfast, it's like paid for by the European Commission. I'm just like, no.
No, exactly. Well, of course, yeah, but it's still a diesel bus, though, isn't it? Wow. But it's interesting. But you think it's interesting that they've actually made the EU popular in England. I mean, one day they might even fly EU flags from British public buildings. That would be a strange turn up. I guess if Frankie Ball said 3 hard winters and England would have a Remainer majority, which is one of his rather evil jokes.
I think it's a lot less than 3.
Because I think that is a striking thing, is the demographic. It's obviously there's a sort of north-south thing in England as well, because those people who obviously more closely connected with the continent and more likely to, less likely to have suffered from, well-paid manufacturing jobs being shipped out to Eastern Europe, and contract labourers being brought in on short-term contracts to undermine local pay and conditions. There's some very real reasons why people didn't like the EU.
Oh yeah, no, there's a whole host of reasons to be legitimately critical of it.
Leave, what is most striking is the age difference. How
do you explain that? Because I honestly I understand to an extent, but the referendum plus that general election result, just the fact it's become so age indicating as to who you're going to vote for is.
I've never happened like that in my lifetime. I mean, there's always been, younger people who are, more likely to vote Labour.
Yeah, I think 2015 was right. So if you looked at young people, the Conservatives had about 30% of the vote to about 36 or so for Labour. So there was little to choose from 18 to 30.
And certainly in 2010, the Lib Dems, who are essentially a Conservative party, had a huge youth vote. Partly because they were mistakenly seen as left of centre. Yeah. Because they
were on a lot of issues.
Well, anti-tuition fees, anti-foreign intervention, but they were, the clue is in the name, liberal.
Well, I think the Lib Dems get a bad rap. I feel like we maybe don't appreciate how much they held back in 5 years.
No, I disagree. No, this is where I completely disagree with you. This is the point about doing these war games. We played a game which on the same sort of method that we did role playing of the coalition building, and if you gamed it, you knew how strong the position that the Dems had, and they didn't game it. So they had.
Do you think they negotiated poorly, or do you think they just didn't realise the position they were in, or
because they didn't game it. They never gamed it. They never gamed what would happen if there was a coalition government. So they went into it with a civil service that was organising negotiations that had gamed it. So they railroaded them into becoming the junior partner in the Tories and passing all that horrible austerity stuff that people are suffering from now. And so it seems to me that and whereas the DUP, which has had lots of experience of getting the maximum amount of coalition agreement, it is amazing how much, where they're in a similar position. Look at how much better they've done. For a start, they didn't need to go into, I think the Lib Dems were so desperate to become ministers, and the civil service.
They just got a whiff of it and signed their life away.
Signed the party away. Though, of course, if the Tory party does collapse and they have to make a new bourgeois party, the Lib Dems are obviously in a very strong position there.
This will be our last question, but so actually I've got two questions here. First of all, how do you think that digital democracy, to what extent do you think that can be a part of the way that a government works, in that we saw how susceptible people are to misinformation and to fake news, if you want to use that term. How much do you think people can be relied upon to be a part of the policy making process? And then sort of tagged on and not related, do you think the Tories
if you look at political theory since Aristotle and Plato, it's all right up to today. It's all a fear of the mob. The mob will be swayed by demagogues.
Well, I don't think it's completely unfounded fear.
Isn't it?
Well, you only have to look at the American situation. While I wasn't a big Clinton fan in any way, shape or form, Trump is a terrifying occupant of the office.
She's terrifying.
Well, she's terrifying as well, but what you would have got from Clinton is not like an utter degradation of all political norms.
Yeah, but she would have invaded Syria to save Al Qaeda. That's it.
What is Trump doing? Bombing Syria, more troops in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I don't know, but he didn't invade Syria, like a full-scale military.
Wow.
I know people in America who didn't vote in the presidential election because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Clinton.
I'd have probably written Sanders in.
Yeah, or just voted for some
Jill Stein or
something.
Gary Johnson.
Anyone but those two. I would find it very, very difficult to vote for Clinton because her track record, Honduras, Haiti, Libya, Syria, Ukraine. That's even before you think of all the corruption.
Yeah,
that she's involved with that family. She's taking money from the Saudis. They really are. They really are. So Trump is horrible and she's horrible. So there's sometimes when the lesser evil choice comes to it, they're just both so evil you can't face them. So that's a good example about the failure of representative democracy when people feel like they have no choice, and then they will do. That's when charlatans like Trump can come to power. Because if they're offered Clinton, they'll go, right, okay, I'll vote for Trump then, or not vote at all. Yeah. So one of the reasons to be interested in digital democracy is actually to make democracy be actually democracy. Because at the moment we've got a system where you elect representatives, and that is democracy. Now the ancient Greeks wouldn't think that's democracy; they think that's oligarchy. Elections are the way you pick oligarchs. Yeah. And so one of the reasons to deepen participation is actually so people can participate in the process. But it has to be a reiterative process. It has to be reiterative. You see, that's, again, it comes back to our earlier discussion, is in a way what you want to do is have a continually voting process. So you're taking decisions, checking them, improving them. That's what you do in the digital world anyway. You don't just produce a piece of software and say, yes, no.
Oh, yeah.
You just continually update. And in a way, that's what democracy has to become more like. This is how it's not a product; it's a process.
It's almost more incremental.
Well, yeah, I think exactly, and that means that yes, it's important. So I think representative democracy. You have to understand. I'm an old punk and was really into situationism, and in a way, the Workers' Council will replace parliamentary democracy, all this sort of stuff. Certainly by the early 1980s I didn't believe that, but I do think that the critique of this, that you have one election every 5 years and then in between that you just obey the government. This is a real problem, I think, because it alienates people from the political process. It means that it tends to mean all the political class converge. I was talking about this Jonathan Powell new Machiavelli book, and by the end he's saying, isn't it great there's no difference between the Blairites and Cameron's Tories? Well, I think, yes, there is. That is the biggest critique of the whole Blair government. You ended up where there was no difference. There's no really discernible difference between, because it's all neoliberal economics and foreign interventionism and marketising the state, and that's not a difference. That's, you know, you're just football teams, not political parties, and certainly not class parties.
Different coloured ties.
Yeah, but you know, the Labour Party, as the name suggests, is a class party, not some, you know, vehicle to get bureaucrats better jobs and large pension schemes. So it seems to me that the purpose is to actually, you know, to use again these old analogy, you know, it's not the rule of the few, it's the rule of the many, and you actually have got to use this to actually get the many involved in politics, but also to get them involved in a continual process. Because, you know, something like Brexit is a good example where people would have a one-off choice between two bad choices in a way, and the information wasn't very good, so they were provided. And certainly my feeling was during the referendum campaign, what the Labour leadership was saying was completely excluded from the airways. Jeremy did 140 meetings, but they were hardly covered, because he wasn't saying what the Remain campaign wanted them to say.
Well, the myth was that he didn't really campaign.
Well, they were preparing the chicken coup, so I think that was also part of why they kept him off the airwaves, slightly conspiratorial about it. But I'm sure the Blair...
Well, that didn't go very well for them.
No, well, I think yes, exactly. I think the fact that Brexit actually happened, the vote, I think they thought that Remain were going to just win, and I must admit, I would have, again, if I had to bet money, I would have thought they would have won by a very small majority.
Well, I went to bed and they were up.
Yeah.
By a couple of percent, and I was like, oh, it'll be fine. No need to worry. And then I woke up and...
Well, because all those nice Tory people, old people, voted for radical change, right? Where you think they're called, you know, they're supporters of a Conservative party. And when push came to shove, I must admit, I thought they would be more conservative. But in a way, we didn't... I think a lot of people, again, because they don't know enough Tories, didn't realise that it was seen as the Conservative choice, that actually Europe is seen as this nation-building project. Yeah, and again, I think that's the young-old thing. I mean, the younger people don't really have any great difficulty in saying, I know, I'm a Londoner, I'm English, I'm British, I'm European. But obviously, for an older generation, that's quite a difficult thing to do. I mean, Boris Johnson wrote this article in the Telegraph, and it was really interesting. He was freaked out about young people painting their face blue and putting 12 gold stars on it. Well, again, you know, if you go to Ireland, people can be very patriotically Irish and pro-European. In fact, being pro-European is being patriotically Irish to preserve Ireland from the Brits, if nothing else. And it's not just money, actually. I mean, money helps, but it's not just money. And I think that's the interesting about that sort of multiple identities, to go back to another earlier discussion, is that people find it much easier, I think, the younger generation. And also they've got access to, you know, different sources of information. They're more likely to travel to Europe, around Europe. They're more likely to have had relationships with Europeans. They're more likely to have a parent who comes from elsewhere in Europe as well. So their whole experience has been different, you know. So you think somebody in their 70s or 80s, or lives out in the, you know, in sort of small, you know, it's a small town versus big city as well, though. So they're less likely to have done as much travelling. Yeah. So that's and again, you know, you think if you grow up, if you spend your entire time watching BBC News and reading the Mail, you're going to have a very weird view of the world. And it's not surprising, therefore...
I think that literally just explains my mother.
Yeah. yeah. I mean,
I've managed to convince her to not read the Mail anymore, but...
Yeah. Well, even people I know read The Guardian have a very weird view of the world. I mean, I spent a lot of my life reading The Guardian. I gave up over their terrible foreign coverage and their monstering of Jeremy.
Yeah, well, that really soured my opinion of them.
But that has a very strange view of the world. So any of these media, I think, as I said, I think one of the interesting is the younger generation they've grown up in this world where they have many more diverse sources of information, and they're not necessarily any more reliable. I mean, the idea that somehow fake news has only arrived in the last few years is laughable.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you know, the tabloid press in this country are being the biggest purveyors of fake news ever. You know,
just one.
And
Hillsborough.
Hillsborough. I mean, and BBC News is fake news. You know, all news is fake in a way because it's a construction of human beings, and they take reality and turn it into a spectacle, as Guy Debord would call it.
Yeah, so CNN's political theatre.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it's all, but I think that is a key. So if we're going to have digital democracy, it needs to be a continual process, and it needs to be something you start, say, in the Labour Party, and try and get our members and trade unionists involved in discussion. And it's not a substitute for meetings and voting and representative, but it's something to widen it out. I mean, a good example is, I know we're talking about, asking people from, the National Health Service, like your mother, to get involved in how the National Health Service should be run and organised. Well, she's probably very busy. She might have small children. She might have people with disability, or she has a disability. So going to meetings is difficult. But if you could give her, put an app so when she's on the bus, she can sit and input her ideas or say whether things are good or bad, that would be really good, because then you'd allow people different levels of engagement. Some people will get really, really involved and write you multi-page documents or go to lots of meetings, be very vocal. Other people will just want to say yes, no, or have interesting comments, be able to feedback certain specialised bits to it. And it's to be able to have that levels of engagement, from very, very close involvement to maybe much less engagement. But that's because often, as I said, they've got very other things in their lives to do. But there's Benjamin Constant, who was this French liberal in the early 19th century, said, well, the difference, the great thing about representative democracy is most people don't want to be involved in politics. But actually that's not true. I think most people would be involved in politics. They just think most politics, as it's presented to them, isn't to do with them. They're told they're not allowed to participate, or it's constructed in such a way it's really boring. So if you actually try to engage people in politics and encourage them to learn and to participate, they will. And they've got something to say.
As soon as you tell people that, everything that almost every aspect of your life is like, well, the way that's going to play out or the way that's going to be structured is the people you vote for.
Yeah.
But on that note, shall we wrap up?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on the show and chatting to us.
And hello to Belfast, a wonderful city.
Yes. Thanks very much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I enjoyed conducting it. Richard was a really interesting person to talk to, and I hope you got some insightful things out of listening. Later in the week, we have an interview with Francesca Lake from Future Science Group, and next week we've got interviews with people from Red Pepper, the Socialist magazine, and with Harry Baker, the Islam poet. So be sure to subscribe if you want to get those. Until next time, thanks very much.